The great chamber of the Galactic Council was a place where no voice was supposed to shake, but tonight the silence was heavier than steel. Rows of alien senators, each from a different world, leaned forward in their seats. Their eyes glowed in strange colors, their faces twisted with suspicion, curiosity, and fear. At the center of the hall stood a single human. Her name was Commander Elara Voss. She was not tall compared to the insectoid senators, nor massive like the reptilian warlords, but she stood with a kind of stillness that made even predators uneasy. Her black uniform carried no medals. She had torn them off long ago. One senator, with a face like cracked stone and eyes of burning blue, slammed his hand on the desk and broke the silence. His voice carried across the chamber like a hammer. "Human," he said, "how many battles have you survived?" The question echoed around the hall, bouncing off the walls, circling above the crowd like a predator waiting for blood. The crowd leaned forward. Some expected a number so high it would be impossible. Others expected her to exaggerate, to brag like humans were known to do. A few whispered that she would stay silent, ashamed of what she had done. Elara Voss lifted her head. Her eyes were colder than ice, sharper than a blade. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She let the silence stretch until it became painful. Then, in a voice low enough to make the chamber lean in, she whispered, "Everyone. That's why I can't sleep." The words hit harder than any weapon. For a moment, even the breathing of the alien senators seemed to stop. They had wanted a number. They had expected some count, some limit, some shape to her war. Instead, she gave them infinity. Every battle, every war, every storm of fire she had walked through, she had survived. Not once had death claimed her. Not once had she been left behind. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others hissed in fear. On the upper balcony, a group of reptilian generals tightened their claws on the railing. They had fought humans before, and some of them had heard her name. Now they knew the rumors were true. Elara Voss was the soldier who never fell. But her words were not spoken with pride. They were spoken with something else, something heavier. Her voice trembled not with weakness but with exhaustion, the weight of ghosts pressing against every syllable. That was why she did not sleep. It was not victory that haunted her. It was survival. The chamber seemed to dissolve into a blur. Faces of aliens faded into shadows. Elara's mind slipped backward, dragged by memories too sharp to ignore. She saw the beginning. The first war. The first nightmare. The flashback came with the smell of smoke and blood. Years ago, on the wild jungle planet of Drakkar, her unit of young soldiers had landed in the middle of a nightmare. The predators there were not like anything humans had faced before. They were 4 meters tall, with claws like curved swords and jaws built to crush armor. The other species called them the Rendrak, and they laughed when they heard humans had been sent to fight them. To the galaxy, humans were weak prey, flesh and bone that would be torn apart in seconds. Her unit had been small, barely 20 soldiers. They were fresh recruits, nervous but hopeful. They carried rifles that hummed with borrowed alien tech, but even their weapons looked too small against the forest shadows. Elara had been young then, but even at 19 her eyes carried something others did not. She had seen violence before the war. She had learned to study her enemies like puzzles, not like monsters. The first attack came at night. 5 Rendrak beasts burst from the trees, glowing eyes and snapping jaws. Soldiers screamed, some firing wildly, others frozen in terror. The forest exploded with sound, metal against claw, screams against roars. Within seconds, the squad was torn apart. Limbs on the ground. Shouts swallowed by silence. Elara moved differently. She did not scream. She did not run. She studied the way the Rendrak lunged, the way their weight shifted before they struck, the way their thick hides bent at the joints. She fired not at their chests but at the gaps behind their shoulders. She aimed not at their jaws but at the soft points behind the eyes. One beast fell. Then another. The survivors of her squad saw her move like someone possessed, calm in the middle of chaos, precise where others were blind. By the end of the night, 15 soldiers lay dead, their blood soaking the soil. Only 3 survived, and Elara was the reason they still breathed. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She stood in the blood-soaked forest, her face pale, her eyes hollow. In her ears, the screams of the dead would not stop. The galaxy later called it the Drakkar miracle. They said it was proof that humans were stronger than they seemed. But Alara knew the truth. It was no miracle. It was survival, and survival came with a cost. Every scream stayed with her. Every face carved itself into her memory. And as the years went on, as every battle stacked on top of the last, she carried them all. She carried too many. That was why her eyes were cold now, why her voice trembled when she whispered her answer to the council. Back in the chamber, the silence after her words grew unbearable. One insectoid senator leaned forward, his antennae twitching nervously. "Everyone," he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Impossible. No human could fight in so many wars and still stand here breathing." Alara turned her head slowly, her gaze cutting through him like a knife. "Then perhaps I'm not breathing," she said, her tone flat. The senator flinched. The chamber stirred again with uneasy whispers. Deep inside her, the memories kept pressing forward, scratching at the edges of her mind. The Rendrak were only the beginning. More battles waited to be remembered, each darker than the last. And she knew the council would not stop with one question. They would demand to know what she had done, how she had survived, and what price the galaxy had paid for her survival. For now, though, the silence in the hall belonged to her. One human. One soldier. One survivor. And the shadows of every battle followed close behind. The chamber lights burned bright, but inside Alara's mind it was still dark. The council had demanded her battle count, but her answer had dragged her back into the past. She could not escape it. Every time she closed her eyes, she returned to the first nightmare, the one that never left her. It began on the jungle world of Drakkar. The air there was heavy and damp, filled with the cries of strange beasts. Thick vines hung from massive trees, and every shadow seemed alive. It was supposed to be a simple mission: secure an outpost, build defenses, prove that humans could hold ground like the other species of the galaxy. That was what the commanders had promised. But soldiers learn quickly that promises mean nothing when the blood starts to fall. Alara had been only 19, one of 20 recruits dropped into the forest. The squad was nervous but hopeful, laughing in low voices as they set up camp. They joked about home, about food, about what they would do when the war was over. Alara stayed quiet. She felt the forest watching. The silence between the animal calls made her skin crawl. She knew something waited for them. It struck the second night. The Rendrak. No one had warned them about the Rendrak. Creatures built for war, 4 meters tall, skin like stone, claws sharp enough to rip through armor. The galaxy had called humans prey, and on that night the Rendrak seemed ready to prove it. The attack began with a scream. A shadow dropped from the trees, slamming into the first guard. The man vanished under claws and teeth. Gunfire exploded through the camp, but the beams of light did nothing against the beast's thick hides. Soldiers panicked, shouting, firing wildly. Some tried to run, only to be cut down before they took 10 steps. Alara did not freeze. She dropped low, rolling into cover as a Rendrak crashed through the tents. She studied it through the smoke and chaos, her mind cutting the beast apart piece by piece. The armor plates overlapped at the joints. The jaw opened wide before the kill. The eyes glowed, but beneath them there was soft flesh. She took a breath, aimed, and fired into the gap behind the shoulder. The beast roared and fell. Another lunged at her from the side. She ducked, firing into the throat as its jaw snapped shut inches from her face. The smell of its blood was thick and sour. She turned, saw 2 of her squad still alive, paralyzed with fear. "Move!" she shouted, dragging them into cover. She reloaded calmly, even as screams tore through the forest. By dawn, 15 soldiers lay dead. The camp was nothing but blood, shredded canvas, and broken weapons. Alara stood with 2 survivors, both too shocked to speak. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were empty. The Rendrak had been driven back, but not destroyed. The war had only begun. That was the first time she realized humans were different. Other species broke when slaughtered like that. Humans did not. They adapted. They learned. They became harder. Alara buried the dead herself, one by one, her hands covered in dirt and blood. Each grave felt heavier than her own body. At night, She could not close her eyes. Every time she tried, she heard the screams again. But the war did not wait for her grief. Days later, new orders came. The survivors of her squad were folded into another unit. The commanders praised her for saving lives. They called her sharp, called her tactical, called her something special. She felt nothing. She had not saved enough. The battles on Drakkar stretched for weeks. Ambush after ambush, patrol after patrol. Every time the Rendrak struck, more humans died, but Alara lived. She always lived. Her instincts sharpened until she could sense the enemy before they moved. She began setting traps, digging pits lined with spikes, stringing explosive charges through the trees. She stopped thinking like prey. She started thinking like a predator. The Rendrak noticed. They began to fear the human with the cold eyes, the one who moved without panic. They tried to hunt her, focusing their attacks on her unit. But every time, she survived, leaving the jungle filled with their corpses. Soon, even her own soldiers looked at her differently. Some whispered she was cursed. Others said she was chosen. Alara said nothing. One night, after a brutal skirmish, she sat alone by the fire. The last soldier from her original squad sat across from her. His name was Kane, and his arm was bandaged from shoulder to wrist. He looked at her with haunted eyes. "Why you?" he asked softly. "Why do you always survive when the rest of us don't?" Alara stared into the flames. She had no answer. She wanted to say it was luck. She wanted to say it was training. But deep inside she knew the truth. She had something inside her that refused to die, even when death pressed its claws against her throat. And that something would not let her rest. Weeks later, Kane was gone too, cut down in another ambush. Once again, Alara lived. Alone again, she marched through the jungle with blood on her boots and ghosts on her shoulders. The council later called it the Drakkar campaign. They said humans had proven their worth. They said humanity had earned respect. But Alara never respected herself for it. Every battle she survived carved another scar inside her. And as the wars spread beyond Drakkar, as new enemies rose and new blood was spilled, the pattern repeated. She lived. Others died. The galaxy began to whisper her name, but she carried only silence inside. Back in the council chamber, the memory faded, but the weight of it stayed. The senators still stared at her, waiting for more. They wanted details. They wanted numbers. But what could she tell them? That she remembered the faces of every soldier she buried? That their screams filled her nights? That her survival was not a gift but a curse? Alara Voss straightened, her voice steady though her heart was heavy. "The First War taught me," she said. "It taught me that survival has a cost. And I have paid it, battle after battle." The chamber remained silent. Even the most hostile senators did not speak. Somewhere in the shadows, a reptilian general leaned back, his claws tapping nervously against the desk. The truth was becoming clear. Alara was not just a soldier. She was something far more dangerous. A human who carried every battle in her bones, and was still standing. The chamber was still quiet when Alara's voice faded. The senators leaned forward, as if waiting for her to break, waiting for some crack to show in her cold eyes. But there was none. She stood like stone. Yet inside her, memories clawed forward again, pulling her into another nightmare. The Drakkar jungle had been the beginning, but the war on Vena was the moment she stopped being a soldier and became something else entirely. The colony world of Vena was supposed to be safe. It was a jewel of green plains and silver rivers, a place where humans had built homes and farms. Families lived there, not soldiers. Children laughed in the fields, far from the blood-soaked jungles of Drakkar. But safety in the galaxy was always an illusion, and illusions always shattered when the enemy came. The reptilian warlords of the Kreth had decided Vena was weak. They came in the night skies, ships blotting out the stars, dropping soldiers and machines into the colony. Their army was vast, thousands of scaled warriors armed with plasma spears and armored hides. The human defenders were only a handful of troops and civilians with old rifles. The Kreth expected an easy slaughter. Alara was stationed there by chance, transferred after Drakkar. She had been hoping for rest, for silence, for a chance to feel human again. Instead, She woke to the sound of sirens and fire raining from the sky. The siege began with terror. Families ran through the streets as Kreth warbands smashed through defenses. Houses burned. The screams of children echoed across the plains. Ilara watched the first line of soldiers fall in minutes. She knew then that no reinforcements would come. They were alone. But Ilara was not the kind to bow to hopelessness. She moved through the chaos with deadly calm, gathering the scattered survivors. "We fight smart," she told them. "We fight like wolves, not sheep." Her voice carried a weight that made even civilians listen. Fearful farmers, wounded soldiers, even children old enough to carry a weapon, all looked at her and saw something stronger than fear. She turned the colony into a trap. Streets were lined with hidden explosives. Barns became ambush points. Irrigation ditches filled with sharpened stakes. She taught the farmers to strike at night, to use fire and noise to make the Kreth believe there were more humans than there truly were. Every shadow became dangerous. Every building became a weapon. The first time the Kreth marched into the center of town, expecting surrender, the ground erupted beneath them. Explosives turned their armored ranks into broken bodies. From rooftops, farmers with rifles fired into the confusion. Ilara moved like a ghost, striking and vanishing, her shots always aimed for the gaps between the armor scales. The Kreth howled in fury, their easy victory turning into blood-soaked frustration. But the siege dragged on. Days turned into weeks. Supplies ran low. The humans grew thin and weak, yet Ilara's eyes never softened. She walked among them at night, whispering that survival was possible, that no enemy was invincible. She told them lies she wanted to believe herself. She told them they could win. The Kreth responded with cruelty. They captured civilians from the outer farms, executed them in view of the defenders, left their bodies hanging from burnt-out walls. The message was clear: surrender or die. But Ilara did not bend. She gathered the children, made them look at the horror, and said, "Remember this. Remember what they did. Then fight." The battle that broke the siege came in fire and screams. The Kreth launched their largest assault, pouring into the colony with machines of war that towered over houses. Their roars shook the ground. Civilians panicked, but Ilara stood at the front, rifle steady, voice cutting through the fear. "Hold. Wait. Strike when they are blind." The humans unleashed their last trap. Oil poured through the ditches, set alight by burning arrows. Fire raced across the battlefield, consuming machines and Kreth soldiers alike. From the smoke, Ilara led the charge, her small force cutting through chaos like a blade. She fought not as prey but as a predator, her rifle cracking, her blade flashing when the rifle was empty. She did not stop, even when blood covered her hands, even when bodies fell at her feet. By dawn, the Kreth army was broken. Hundreds of them lay dead. Their commanders fled in shame, leaving their dead behind. The humans of Vayner stood among the ruins, burned and blooded but alive. Against all reason, against all odds, they had survived. The galaxy called it the Siege of Vayner. They praised the miracle defense. They spoke of Ilara Voss as if she were more than human. The council noted the event in their archives, cold and clinical, but the people of Vayner told stories of the woman who turned farmers into warriors and flames into victory. But Ilara felt no pride. She walked among the graves of the fallen, her hands still shaking from the weight of the blade she carried. She remembered the faces of the children she had told to fight, some now buried in the soil. She remembered the eyes of the Kreth commander who had begged for mercy before she shot him down. She carried it all inside her. Back in the council chamber, she looked at the alien senators who stared at her with wide, fearful eyes. They wanted to believe the siege had been a miracle. They wanted to believe she was a symbol of hope. But her voice cut through their illusions. "Do not call it a miracle," she said softly. "Call it what it was. A slaughter. A colony drenched in fire. I survived because I refused to die, not because the gods blessed me." The senators shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to one another. A few lowered their eyes. Ilara's words carried no triumph. They carried only truth, heavy and sharp as a blade. And behind that truth was a shadow the council could not ignore. If one human could break a siege with nothing but fire, traps, and willpower, what would humanity become when the rest of them learned to fight like her? The council chamber remained heavy with silence. Elara's voice had painted the siege of Vena not as a legend, but as a scar. The alien senators shifted in their seats, their eyes reflecting unease. Some whispered, trying to convince themselves that humans were still weak, still fragile. But deep inside, every one of them knew, something had changed on Vena. Elara Voss had proved that humans could not only survive, but they could make their enemies break. Her mind slipped again, dragged into another memory she could never forget. If Drakkar had been the first nightmare, and Vena had been the fire of survival, then the Kreth War brought something different. It was not about staying alive anymore. It was about breaking the enemy until even their leaders begged for mercy. The Kreth were a reptilian empire that thrived on conquest. For centuries, they had enslaved weaker species, forcing them into mines and armies. To them, war was a sport, and mercy was weakness. They had expected humanity to be just another slave race. But after Vena, their arrogance began to crack. Still, they refused to stop. The war reached its darkest moment on the desert world of Karesh. The Kreth had gathered their largest force there, planning to crush the human resistance in one final strike. Their leader, Warlord Sarek, marched at the front of tens of thousands, his scaled body covered in black armor, his voice roaring promises of human extinction. Elara Voss was sent with only a few hundred soldiers, most of them weary survivors from earlier battles. They looked at the endless Kreth army and felt despair. "We can't win this," one whispered. Elara only stared at the dunes, her face like carved stone. "Then we make them lose," she replied. She turned the desert into a weapon. Her soldiers dug trenches, set mines beneath the sand, and camouflaged their positions with broken machines. They used the sun to blind the Kreth, striking at dawn and dusk when shadows stretched long. The desert winds carried smoke and dust, making every step dangerous. The battle raged for days. The Kreth roared forward in wave after wave, their numbers like a tide. But every wave was met with fire and steel. Explosions ripped through their ranks. Snipers hidden in the dunes struck commanders before they could order an attack. At night, Elara led raids into their camps, blades flashing in the dark, leaving trails of terror behind. Still, the Kreth did not stop. They poured more and more soldiers into the desert, determined to drown the humans with sheer numbers. The ground became a graveyard of scaled bodies. The air smelled of blood and burning metal. Elara moved among her soldiers like a ghost, never resting, never hesitating. She killed with precision, her eyes always scanning, always calculating. At last, the humans captured Warlord Sarek. It happened in the chaos of a night raid. His guards fell in seconds, their throats cut before they could cry out. Elara herself dragged him into the sand, his black armor cracked, his scaled face twisted with rage and disbelief. For the first time in his life, the mighty Kreth leader was a prisoner. The humans dragged him before the remaining Kreth soldiers. His army stood frozen, their claws trembling, their eyes wide. They had never seen their leader weak, never seen him fall. Now he knelt in the sand, bound and beaten, while Elara stood above him. She pressed a blade under his jaw, but she did not strike. Instead, she made him speak. "Tell them," she said coldly. Sarek resisted, his eyes burning with hatred. But when Elara drove the blade deeper, drawing blood, he broke. His voice cracked as he shouted to his soldiers to surrender. The desert fell silent. Thousands of Kreth dropped their weapons. For the first time in their history, they knelt, not to their own kind, but to a human. The council would later call it a strategic victory. They would write in their records that Elara had captured the Kreth leader and forced a surrender. But the truth was darker. Elara had not just beaten the Kreth, she had broken them. She had turned their pride into ash, their strength into shame. And she had done it not with mercy, but with cruelty. That night, as the humans rested among the dunes, her soldiers celebrated. They laughed, cheered, and sang of victory. But Elara sat alone on a broken piece of metal, staring at her blood-stained blade. She remembered the look in Sarek's eyes when he begged, when he gave the order to surrender. She remembered the silence of his soldiers as their spirits shattered. For a moment, she wondered if she had gone too far. She had wanted to survive. She had wanted her people to live. But somewhere along the way, survival had turned into something else. She no longer fought only to live. She fought to make sure her enemies remembered her forever. She fought to carve fear into their bones. Back in the council chamber, her voice was steady but heavy when she spoke. "I made him beg," she said simply. The senators shifted uneasily. Some hissed in disgust. Others stared at her in awe. He was not just defeated. He was broken. "And I made his people watch." One insectoid senator leaned forward, his voice sharp. "That is cruelty, not victory." Ilara turned her eyes on him, cold and unflinching. "To you, maybe. To me, it was survival. To him, it was justice." The senator fell silent. Around the chamber, whispers spread like fire. The truth was clear: humans were no longer the prey of the galaxy. They were something else. Something the galaxy had never seen before. And Ilara Voss, the survivor of every battle, was proof of it. The chamber lights burned cold and harsh. Ilara's words about the Kreth warlord still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The alien senators shifted uneasily, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Some looked at her with fear, others with disgust, but none could look away. The silence grew sharp, as if the entire council feared the sound of their own voices. At last, a senator with scales the color of rust rose to his feet. His voice hissed across the hall. "You admit it. You admit you broke a leader before his people? That you forced him to surrender in shame?" His claws tapped against the desk. "That is not honor. That is cruelty." Ilara did not flinch. She stood tall, her black uniform plain, her face cold as stone. "Yes," she said softly. "I broke him. And I will not apologize." A ripple of shock spread through the chamber. Many senators leaned back as if struck. Others whispered furiously to one another. For them, war had rules. For them, pride mattered more than survival. But Ilara was human, and humans had learned that rules meant nothing when extinction stared them in the face. Another senator, tall and insectoid, clicked his mandibles in anger. "You are dangerous, human. Not because of your strength, but because you carry no limits. You carry only survival." Ilara's gaze turned toward him. "You call it dangerous," she said. "I call it necessary. Every battle I lived through taught me one thing: mercy in war is not mercy. It is a delay. If I had spared him, if I had let him keep his pride, his soldiers would have risen again. They would have slaughtered us. They would have slaughtered our children. I did what had to be done." The insectoid shrank back, his antennae trembling. Ilara's voice was not raised, but it cut sharper than any blade. A younger senator, his skin pale and his eyes like liquid silver, spoke next. His tone was calmer, though filled with suspicion. "And yet, you stand here alive. Alive when so many others did not. You have fought in wars across half the stars, and still you stand. How? How many battles have you truly survived?" The question rippled through the hall again. It was the same question as before, but now heavier, now darker. Ilara's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the faces pressing against her, the soldiers she had buried, the screams she still heard in her dreams. "I told you already," she said quietly. "Every one." The chamber erupted. Senators shouted over one another, some calling her a liar, others calling her cursed. The reptilian generals in the upper gallery hissed threats. The insectoid delegation chattered in disbelief. Even the oldest counselors, who had seen centuries of war, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. But through the noise, Ilara's voice cut clean. "You want numbers. You want records. But humans do not count battles. We carry them." She pressed a hand against her chest. "Every one. Every scream. Every face. They do not leave us. That is why I cannot sleep." The shouting faltered. The hall grew still again. For the first time, the senators saw not only a warrior, but the shadow that followed her. Her survival was not victory. It was a curse. And it weighed heavier than any chain. She continued, her tone colder now. "You sit here in this chamber, safe, asking for numbers. But numbers mean nothing. Do you know how many graves I dug with my own hands? Do you know how many times I heard soldiers beg for their mothers before they died? Do you know how many children I told to fight, because there was no one left but them?" Her voice rose slightly, shaking with iron. "I remember all of them. Every one. And they remember me. The silence after her words was unbearable. Some senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared at her as if she were something not entirely human. Finally, an elder counselor with a face like carved stone spoke in a trembling voice. Then you are not a soldier. You are a ghost who walks among us. Elara's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile, but there was no joy in it. Maybe I am, she said. Maybe I should have died long ago. But I didn't. And now I carry them all. The chamber remained frozen. The senators had asked for a testimony, but what they had received was something else, an indictment, a confession, a warning. Elara turned slowly, her boots echoing on the floor as she walked to the center of the hall. Every step seemed to make the senators lean back farther in their seats. She raised her head and spoke, her voice calm but filled with steel. You wanted to know why you should fear humans, she said. It is not because we are strong. It is not because we are clever. It is because we do not forget. Every war shapes us. Every grave hardens us. And every battle we survive becomes a weapon we carry forward. The words hung heavy, sinking into the bones of everyone who heard them. Across the galaxy, news of her testimony would spread. Leaders would whisper in private chambers. Generals would wonder what kind of species could carry so much pain and still rise to fight again. The council chamber was silent once more, but this silence was not like the beginning. This silence was fear. Fear of the survivor who stood before them. Fear of the species she represented. Fear of what might come if humans, all humans, became like Elara Voss. The council chamber no longer felt like a hall of power. It felt like a tomb. The senators sat frozen, their alien eyes darting toward one another, but none dared speak. Elara Voss stood alone in the center, her shadow stretched across the marble floor. Her last words, every battle we survive becomes a weapon we carry forward, still hung in the air like smoke. At last, the elder counselor with the stone-carved face leaned forward, his voice shaking. Commander Voss, what is it you want from us? You did not come here only to speak of battles. Why now? Why tell us this truth? Elara's eyes lifted, and for the first time, there was something more than steel in them. There was sorrow. Because you sit here and argue about treaties, about who is to blame, about which flag should wave over which world, she said quietly. And out there, in the dark, something is coming. The chamber stirred, nervous whispers breaking through. Coming, one senator demanded. What do you mean? Elara's voice deepened, firm and cold. The Kreth War was not the last war. It was not even the worst. There are things older than your council, older than human history, watching us. I've seen hints of them. Shadows on ruined worlds. Signals that vanish before they can be traced. An enemy that does not bargain, does not surrender, does not care about honor or law. When they come, no treaty will protect you. No tradition will save you. Only those who survive every battle will be ready. The hall erupted in noise again. Some senators shouted in disbelief. Others hissed that she was lying to frighten them. A few sat silent, their faces pale, because they knew her words were not the talk of madness. They had heard rumors too. One senator, his skin gleaming silver under the lights, slammed a fist against his desk. And why should we believe you? You admit you are haunted. You admit you cannot sleep. Perhaps these shadows you see are only nightmares. Elara's gaze locked on him. Her voice was ice. Do you think I want these nightmares? Do you think I stand here proud of what I have seen? I would give anything to sleep again. But I cannot, because the truth will not let me. You want proof. Look at your own archives. Look at the worlds where entire colonies vanished without a trace. Look at the ships that never returned. You have the data, but you hide it from yourselves. A hush fell. The senator froze, his silver eyes flicking to the elder counselor. It was true, the reports existed. But they had been buried under layers of bureaucracy, ignored because no one wanted to face them. Elara stepped forward. The guards stiffened but did not move. She carried no weapon, but her presence was heavier than any blade. You wanted to know how many battles I've survived. You wanted a number to weigh against your rules. But here is the truth, Every one of those battles was not just survival, it was a lesson. And the lesson is this: if you are not ready to fight without limits, you will lose everything. The chamber was silent, and her voice fell lower, darker. Humans are not cursed because we survive. We are cursed because we remember. I carry every face, every scream, every decision. That is why I cannot sleep. That is why none of you should sleep either. The senators looked at one another, their eyes wide with unease. For the first time, they realized that Alara was not simply confessing. She was warning. The elder counselor's voice trembled. And if you are right? If what you say is true? What then, Commander Voss? Alara's gaze swept across them all. Her next words were slow, each one falling like a hammer. Then your laws, your pride, your honor codes, they will burn with your worlds. The only ones left will be those willing to do what I did. To carry the weight. To become ghosts. The silence was absolute. No senator dared respond. No one wanted to admit it, but her words painted a future too clear to ignore. She stood there a moment longer, her breathing steady, her face unreadable. Then she turned, as if ready to leave. But before she reached the great doors of the chamber, she paused. Without looking back, she spoke one final sentence, her voice soft but sharp as glass. Every battle I survived was not for me. It was to warn you. If you waste that warning, your blood will join my nightmares. The doors opened with a heavy groan, and she walked out into the blinding light of the council hall's outer balcony. Behind her, the chamber was still silent. Not one senator dared move. Outside, the city stretched in every direction, towers of glass and stone glowing against the eternal night of space. Below, thousands of citizens stood gathered, waiting to see the human who had shaken the council. When Alara appeared, the crowd gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. She did not raise her hands. She did not speak to them. She only looked out at the stars. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, but her stance was unbroken. To the people watching below, she was no longer just a soldier. She was something more, a warning carved into flesh and blood. A figure who had walked through every fire and returned scarred but unyielding. And as the council remained paralyzed in fear, the people outside began to understand the chilling truth. The humans were not like the others. They did not measure war in numbers. They measured it in scars. And their ghosts were not buried, they walked beside them. Alara's lips moved in silence, a whisper only the stars could hear. Every one.